Welcome to the presentation on Queen Victoria stamped to order postcards of Great Britain. Call it stamped to order rather than printed to private order because that's what the post office term was used in Great Britain. All those cards would have been done at the stamping office, strangely enough, in Somerset House. Picture you see in front of you is a stamping office in 1810, which is a bit before our time, but it's the only picture I could find. I suspect it wouldn't have been greatly different in the 1870s when stamped order postcards started then. First issue of GB postcards was 1st October 1870, a year after the Austrian ones, and they were fairly obviously post office cards. They came in two sizes. One on the left probably would have been a more sensible size because you got more writing space, but somebody did a study of typical envelope sizes of the time and came up with the size on the right. The size on the right became the standard postcard size, and they dropped the larger size after the first printing, which is a pity because it was actually a more useful, more attractive size, I think. The small size was, however, available in sheets, and you could, if you wanted to print stuff on the back, obviously a sheet was much more useful than doing it on a single card. And this was very widely used for business advertising. What it wasn't popular with, a particular business, was the stationery trade. And this was why. There was a rather, well, let's be polite, let's say it's a rather whiny memorial they sent out to the Postmaster General in 1871. As you can see, the main gist of the complaint was that postal stationery of any kind was unfair competition with their trade. And they particularly objected to postcards because at the time the cards were sold at face value. So they were saying that the actual stationery was being given away, quote unquote. Their request was that the post office should stop selling postal stationery at all, which was obviously never going to fly. But at least failing that, you should charge for it. And they also requested that halfpenny dies should be made available for stamping private postcards, as in other types of stationery. And the last 2 points were agreed on. That is the halfpenny die that they came up with. It's like the contemporary halfpenny bantam stamps. It's a smaller size, roughly half the size of the normal dies. They sent colour trials to the post office with a thing saying, yes, you can have purple like you have on the letterpress cards, but here's all the reasons why you can't. It would be very expensive and not a good idea. And so they chose pink. If you're wondering why they chose pink, which was the same colour as a penny stamp, I'm afraid I don't know. I've never seen an explanation of that. There was also, you also noticed that the post office cards were done in letterpress, so you could do them in sheets. Problem with the embossed dies, you could only stamp one card at a time, and the machines literally wouldn't reach out to do more than one or two cards, if you could even do that. So you couldn't do them in whole sheets. And if you're wondering why not use letterpress, the simple answer was that Somerset House didn't have the capability to do that at the time, or at least not in the quantity that would have been needed for postcard work. As item on the left, I say it appears to be a proof. It's in thick paper rather than card. Purpose and origin, as I say, is not quite sure. I suspect it's a working up strike when they were cleaning the machines or something like that. However, 1872, they introduced stamping to order for cards in 17th of June. Wasn't terribly popular. That's the Postmaster General's report for that year. Of this concession, little use has been made, which is a polite way of putting it. Early STO cards, stamped order, are actually quite hard to find. They get a bit commoner after, say, 1880, but anything from the 1870s is tricky. If you notice the long list of rules there, if you want to look at the presentation later, they basically had to be the same size as the post office issue cards. You could use thicker stock. The telegraph cards, which I'm afraid I didn't illustrate here, were twice the thickness. So you could get better quality card. However, if you're wondering why the limited use, well, two obvious reasons. If you wanted to print stuff on the back, printing in sheets was just vastly more convenient. And also, in 1875, the post office introduced a thicker, better quality card, which they called a stout card as opposed to a thin card. And that was available in sheets in March 1877. So, you know, it would, if you were printing, that was the one you were going to go for unless you had specific reasons why not. The rules about what you could put on this. Essentially, you were supposed to say nothing but postcard and the address line instructions saying address has to be on this side, just to remind people that what to do. So that is your fairly standard STO card, or you could have different fonts, or you could put the address line in 2 lines. There was nothing to say what your formatting had to be, or you could use a fancy font, or you could print it in color, or you could just do weird things like that with the archaic long S stuff. Since there wasn't any formal rule about what else you could put on the decoration on it, some people just let their imagination run wild. So you get these elaborate things with different colors and fancy fonts, and I suspect that quite a number of these were done philatelically. Certainly the one bottom right was. It was. I'm told it was done for Stanley Gibbons. Basically, I suspect for them to get something to sell. There are 3 colours of that. I can't recall ever seeing one used, which probably explains why they were done. If you look back at those rules, they also said you couldn't put the Royal Arms on like you could on the post office cards. However, in 1879, an outfit called the Chiswick Press came up with these rather fancy-looking things with the elaborate illustrated P and C and the old-style long S's. And they also had the Royal Arms on them. Now, I don't know how they got away with that, possibly just somebody didn't notice, but it set a precedent. And these cards were sold, they were sold by stationers and made available to stationers, or you could have them printed for your own use. I mean, the one on the right is printed for an engineering company, but it set a precedent. So you get cards like this, which have very much the same format as the post office cards, apart from the border. If you notice, the Royal Arms are all slightly different variations. I presume each printer would have their own copy of these for things where they're allowed to use them. This is an alternative, one company used. The City Press were a local newspaper. It was early version of the standard, possibly, or precursor of it. I suspect they did this for their own use, being a press company, and they used the arms of the City of London, which you look not lion and unicorn, it's two dragons and a different coat of arms. So this is one of the more unusual cards you get. Use of the royal arms was not always allowed. I suspect the cards you get without them in this format came towards the very end of the period, 1884, 1885, when it had been decided that it wasn't correct after all. So you see things like the one on the left, which have the arms taken out and an odd-looking gap in the middle. And you also have things like the one on the right, where they'd already printed the arms and then slapped something else over them to cancel them out. It could be just a blob, but in this case it was a sort of leafy pattern. And as you can see, that's courtesy Alan Huggins. I borrowed one or two images of things that I didn't have an example of myself. There was another rule which said you weren't to have printing in the space for the stamp on either side of the card. I can only presume the idea behind that was that it wouldn't show through on underneath the stamp and possibly confuse the post office clerks that the card had been used. So you get things like that where they've carefully arranged the text around that space, or carefully arranged the borders so that it sort of cuts out a square, or Alfred Smith, the stamp dealer, done it in little boxes. However, you also get things like that, which obviously is well over the stamp, or like that, which is again making full use of the card. I think that's pretty obviously over the thing. The regulation, I suspect it wasn't, the stamping office weren't too fussed about it. Looking at those, I looked at those cards reasonably carefully. I think they've been done before stamping. Doesn't appear that the pattern of the ink is over the distorted by the trying to print on an embossed card. But I will say, to be fair, that it is quite difficult to tell. Next few pages, they're inevitably going to be cases where people did irregular things, and these are a few examples. This card, again, I suspect it was done by the user for their own specific use. I believe they were a firm of printers when I Googled them. They've obviously tried to match the look of the post office card as closely as you could without actually using the royal arms. They try to match the fonts, and they put a border in the same style of printer's type. Although they printed it in blue, which is for some reason of their own. Possibly they thought it looked nice with pink, I don't know. I've only ever seen one other example of those, which came up on eBay quite recently, which I haven't paid for yet, so unfortunately can't do any illustrations yet. You'll notice on the left side of these that they've clearly been perforated. Now, perforated cards were perfectly all right. There was a rule that said you could perforate, the sheet cards are quite, well, not quite often, but are occasionally perforated, shall we say, by companies who had the machinery. This one, by the look of it, appears to have been done with an attached tab. Those guilloche loops were typically done when you had a two-part form, a check, for example. Originally they would be so you could cut across them in a sort of fancy pattern and match up the two halves later. Obviously, if it's perforated, you can't do that. what I suspect they must have done is had a numbered tab which matched up the receipt for this thing, so you could send out an acknowledgement card for Lord Kinnaird's appeal saying thanks for your shilling or whatever, and match it up with the appropriate tab. It's would have to have been stamped in that form, presumably, but it wasn't entirely according to the regulations. But for a member of the House of Lords, I'm sure they weren't going to complain too much. Or indeed for a stamp office, a rates office. This one wasn't in the original version of the presentation. It only turned up yesterday, so I was sticking an extra card. It's the only card I can remember seeing that's clearly larger than the proper size. It's a 1/4 inch or more too high. But as I say, it's done for the Collector General in Dublin, so I suspect they could do what they like. It, as you can see on the top, it's printed. There's a dashes, which is where you would tear off the extra tab. Looking at it closely, I mean, on the picture it looks like it might be rouletted. If you look at it very closely, it appears to have actually been folded and torn. So, but it's as I say, it's an unusual card to find. So, and turned up in a mixed lot quite unexpectedly, because I hadn't even noticed it was there. However, the main purpose of STO cards was to be sold by stationers. The idea was that you could use cheaper card in the post office and or better card, and hopefully undercut what the post office charged. The one illustrated there is a fairly typical example. The post office tried to, or the Inland Revenue, I suppose we should say, tried to counteract that by introducing a stamping fee and various other things you can see on that slide if you care to go back to it. Most importantly, though, in 1884, the Somerset House finally got a serious letterpress capability and introduced these, which you will see look very like the contemporary post office cards at the time. The difference is because you got this rather silly looking format where they don't have the royal arms in the middle. Somebody made a ruling that it contradicted one of the Stamping Acts. By 1888, as you'll notice in the one on the bottom right, the arms are back. Presumably somebody had a new act, or although I must admit I haven't checked that with the lists of Post Office Acts and Inland Revenue Acts. So you might wonder, how would you distinguish a post office and a stamp to order card? Well, the post office themselves thought of that, and this is how. They basically made a small change to a couple of things. The coat of arms is slightly different. If you can see my pointer, hopefully, the unicorn's collar on the post office cards has a chain on it, and on the stamp to order cards it doesn't. And there's also a full stop after side here on the post office cards, which was taken off from the stamp to order cards. If you're familiar with these cards, you'll know that this particular halfpenny die comes in three dies. The halfpenny die one was the original one, and that's fortunately the only one that's used on stamp to order cards, so you don't need to worry too much about which die it is. The other two were made for a bit later on and for use on post office cards. Sheets are printed with guidelines around the edges, not in between the cards, to show how you were to cut them, which wasn't always accurately done, as you might expect. So the cards do vary slightly in size, and sometimes have these stuff on there. That wavy line appears to be somewhere in the middle of the sheet, I think. I do have it on other examples, although I don't think there's a complete sheet available to say exactly what part of the sheet it was. And you also occasionally got things like that, where they obviously got it completely the wrong way around. But, you know, nice try, guys. Stamp to order cards, the advantage of having your own card printed, obviously, was that you could undercut the post office price, which was 8p a dozen for the stout cards once they'd started charging for the card itself. The thin cards, which really were quite thin, were 7p. But if you could get intermediate quality cards, you could source your own card supplies, you could undercut that. So this Leicester stationer there was charging 7p halfpenny a dozen, or this guy in Bristol was charging 7p a dozen. Do I hear 6p halfpenny a dozen? Stationer in King's Cross. Haven't seen one getting down to face value for the postcards, but you had to charge something for the stamping. 1889, they tried to avoid being undercut too much. The post office price was reduced to 7.2p per dozen, although they were sold in 10 now, 6p for 10, and they bumped up the stamping fee by another shilling. However, you can occasionally get cards which were sold below face. And the way they did that was rather like the Mulberry advertisements back in 1840. They used most of the space to print advertising on them. You'll instantly notice the problem here, because you only had a fairly limited space to write on anyway. Once you put adverts all around them, you've got roughly about enough space to write the 19th century equivalent of a tweet. These are two of the firms that did it. The Farthing Letter Company, which, as you might expect, sold cards at a farthing, and the Anglo-Colonial Letter Company, which, if you can read their very small print, sold 3 cards for a penny. They're stamped to order because if you're doing this, you obviously want to source your own card and keep the prices as low as possible. Used examples, not often seen. I mean, mint examples, not often seen either, but used ones are especially hard to find. So presumably they weren't terribly popular for the reasons already stated. I suspect the one on the right is in a pale pink ink, so you could actually write on top of it if you needed to. If you're mentioning stamped order cards, it's only fair to mention the Postcard Automatic Supply Company Limited. Though were the pioneers in vending machines, and while you think of vending machines as selling, chocolate or whatever nowadays, the first one actually used was to vend postcards, and they were stuck on railway stations, for example. So you could, if you needed to write something quick before your train went, you could stick a coin in the slot, a penny, I think, is the likely price. Get one of these cards, scribble something on it, and drop it in the postbox on the station. Didn't last long as a supplier of postcards, and I don't think, because it figured out that vending cigarettes and chocolate and whatever was much more profitable. But again, it's an STO card because you want to keep the costs of these things as low as possible. A few later exceptions. The colour of the embossed die changed to vermilion in 1892 when they started stamping halfpenny book post rate envelopes. You occasionally get cards such as these, where the single cards have been stamped with the halfpenny vermilion die. The only reason I can think why you would do that is because you already had the cards pre-cut, and so using the embossed die was the only way to do it. And there is also, again, this is one of Alan Huggins. I haven't been able to get hold of an example yet. There's also a stamped order reply card, which uses the halfpenny per million die. I suspect the reason here, again, because the stamp office wouldn't have forms set up to do reply cards for stamped order, because very few people would actually want them. As far as I know, these are only used this 1 year. I've opened a correction on that. It's somebody offering orders for the supplies for the Passover Seder. And there is also, which turned another thing which turned up in a mixed lot very recently, a stamped order penny card. Again, the penny foreign rate cards were normally done by letterpress, but the stamp office wouldn't have had forms for doing those. So again, when somebody wanted a stamped order penny card, the only option was to stamp it with a penny pink. That was a card listed by Robson Lowe in 1952 in the British Empire listing. Nobody had seen an example until recently, not even Alan Huggins. That turned up in a mixed lot that his son David Huggins bought, and nobody had actually noticed it was a postcard rather than envelope until he started dismantling it. So that is the only known one. And if it was, unfortunately, I didn't spot it at the time. So if I had, there would have been a bit of more of a fight for it. Moving on towards the end of the story now. In the 1890s, the post office cards were made some changes. They started issuing the stout cards in this squarer size known as a quart size, 4.5 by 3.5, and the thin cards were issued in what have become the common international size for cards, which is what you think of as the standard size of a postcard when you think of it at all. So that meant that stamped order cards could be in the same sizes, and you got an uncut block of 4 of the quart size cards there, and an example of the large size. You'll also notice that the address only line has been removed. I mean, the original reason for that was just to keep reminding people that you weren't supposed to write anything at all on the front except for the address. Not at the start, you couldn't even put a sender's name on. In 1897, that restriction was relaxed, so you could print on the pictorial matter on the front if you liked. But although the solution for the post office cards I was mentioned was to remove the word only, the solution for the stamped order cards was to take out the whole line, because presumably if you were doing stamped order cards, you knew how you were going to use them. And the final change of the reign was that green ink was used instead of brown, and the 2 sizes to match the post office cards there. The change was to match the UPU colours what postcards should be, and it took a year or so after the change was made for adhesive stamps. It took Delarue that time to find a suitable ink, and presumably because the stamp office were following Delarue, it took them even longer. But it comes in January 1901, so just before the end of the reign. But that was the last change to stamped order cards, and after that you get on to the complexities of Edward VII. So after which, hope that made sense, and if not, any questions?